Faithfully conveying value and interpreting great books from around the world. Hello, this is Sally Book Review. Today I'll be interpreting a book called The President is Unreliable for You. Well, first, I'd like you to think about a small question. In news reports, they often call sudden exposures or negative events such and so gate, like sex photo gate, prism gate, zipper gate, ink splash gate, and so on. So why exactly is that? Today, the book I'm interpreting for you will tell you the answer. It's related to the illegal actions of a U.S. president. This unreliable president was not only impeached himself, but also triggered the biggest constitutional crisis since the founding of the United States. And what got America through that crisis was the system of separation of powers. The three powers refer to the executive, legislative, and judicial systems of the United States. A separation means the relationship between these three systems, where they balance and check each other. The author of this book is named Linda, a pen name used by a Chinese-American couple. Previously, on Sally Book Review, we interpreted another essay collection about American life called Worries from the Depths of History, which mainly covers the content and value of the First to Sixth Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. That's Linda's work, and it's the first book in their Close-Up on America series. So, the book we're discussing today, The President is Unreliable, is part of this series. The second book is also an essay collection. Linda continues to introduce the separation of powers in America and how this system works through letters. Next, I'll interpret this book for you through two key questions. First, what is the U.S. president? Second, is the president bigger than the law? Well, let's look at the first big question. What is the U.S. president? At first glance, this question seems very simple, almost like making a mystery out of nothing. Because we usually think, isn't the U.S. president just the head of the U.S. government? What else could there be to question? Well, when author Linda first arrived in the U.S., they indeed thought the same way. But as they learned more about America, they increasingly felt that simply understanding the U.S. president as the head of the U.S. government was imagining an amplification of the president's powers, or even a misunderstanding. In fact, in the U.S., the president is not the head of the national government. He is only the head of the executive branch among the three branches: legislative, judicial, and executive. So, to put it simply, the U.S. president is just the director of the big administrative office of the federal government. His duty is to oversee the daily affairs of the government. Therefore, the U.S. president is essentially like a chief steward. Compared to the president, Congress, as the legislative branch, actually has more of a national master's feel. Members of the U.S. Congress are directly elected representatives from each state. So the main duty of these representatives is to legislate, meaning the broad principles are set by Congress, and the president is only responsible for leading the administrative team to carry them out. Thus, the president not only can't control Congress, but also, once Congress is dissatisfied with the president's performance, they often immediately pass a resolution to directly express their anger or even impeach the president. As for the judicial branch, the court system consists of district courts and the Supreme Court. We're usually familiar with district courts in various states and cities. Their main job is to hear cases based on existing laws, but what best represents the value of the judicial branch is actually the U.S. Supreme Court. Because the duty of the 9 Supreme Court justices is to step in and interpret and judge when a law itself is controversial or even challenged. Sometimes the Supreme Court assesses whether an existing law aligns with the spirit of the Constitution. Other times, the Supreme Court conducts judicial review on new bills passed by Congress. And if the Supreme Court believes that an existing law or a new bill violates the spirit of the Constitution, it will declare it void immediately, no questions asked. In this way, we can see that the triangular structure of government powers has fundamentally become as stable as a pyramid. The legislative branch, with Congress at its core, does have the power to legislate, but it doesn't have the power to enforce laws, and its legislative actions are constrained by the other two branches. The president has to sign. The Supreme Court reviews the executive branch led by the president. Although it has the power to enforce laws, it cannot arbitrarily create any laws favorable to itself, nor can it freely interpret or distort laws during enforcement. As for the judicial branch, centered around the 9 justices, it can judge and interpret all laws. But besides that, they have no other powers. They are completely unrelated to any actions of the legislative or executive branches. In short, for Americans, legislative, judicial, and executive are three very important government powers. If these three important powers were placed in one system, it would be extremely dangerous. It could easily lead to the system expanding infinitely, doing whatever it wants, and eventually becoming uncontrollable, harming citizens' basic rights. This was something the founders had clearly realized early in the founding of the United States. So, at the outset of the nation's founding, they designed the separation of power system with the aim of dispersing legislative, judicial, and executive powers into three separate systems. For over 200 years, these three branches have remained relatively independent, with strict checks and balances between them. The rationality and practicality shown by this system typically reflect the American way of thinking. First, they dislike excessive, abstract, theoretical discussions, like debating whether human nature is good to prevent people from engaging in corruption, and instead focus on solving problems pragmatically. Second, they are reluctant to trust personal moral self-discipline and prefer to rely on meticulously designed mechanisms. Especially this distrust means they must effectively limit individuals' power desires. This is one of the fundamental principles of the United States from its founding to the present. The founders of America deeply knew that power leads to corruption, and absolute power leads to absolute corruption. This kind of temptation cannot be completely resisted by personal morality alone. Without strong institutional safeguards, a president holding military and financial powers could very likely evolve into a de facto emperor under the catalysis of power. So they meticulously designed the separation of power system to add double safety brakes to the president's power. Thus, we can return to the first big question: what exactly is the U.S. president? Under the structure of separation of powers, the U.S. president is only in charge of the executive branch of the government, and he not only has no control over the legislative and judicial branches, but is also subject to many constraints from them. Next, we'll specifically look at how the safety brakes formed by the legislative and judicial branches work for the executive branch led by the U.S. president, which leads us to the second big question. In the U.S., is the president bigger than the law? First, the author tells an example of President Clinton to illustrate how Congress, as the legislative branch, oversees and restricts presidential power. In the early 1990s, when President Clinton first took office, he wanted to build a reliable and efficient administrative team to assist him. So he nominated several department heads for the executive branch, including the Attorney General of the United States. It should be clarified that this Department of Justice is not the judicial branch of the three government branches we mentioned earlier. It's just a department under the executive branch. This department is responsible for representing the government and investigating various crimes with court authorization. The work of the U.S. Department of Justice relates to Social Security, so it's extremely important for the president's performance record. Clinton also plays great importance on this position. After much consideration, he first nominated a woman who was quite prestigious in the legal field, but the president's nomination is just the starting point. So, under the U.S. separation of powers system, to prevent the president from abusing power for personal gain, all executive branch nominees must undergo strict review by Congress. And when the U.S. Congress does this job, it's diligent and thorough, definitely not just for show or formality. During the review process, if there are significant doubts, they hold hearings and broadcast them live on television nationwide. For Clinton's first nominee, the issue uncovered by Congress was that this woman had once hired a Mexican nanny without legal work status. However, according to the law, when hiring someone, the employer must pay an employment tax. But this woman apparently hadn't paid that tax, and it was because of such a seemingly minor mistake. This woman failed to pass the nomination review by Congress. With no choice, Clinton had to regroup and put forward a second candidate for Attorney General. This time, it was also a woman, but after some time into the congressional review, the second woman couldn't withstand the pressure and confessed herself. It turned out that her household had also illegally hired a Mexican nanny. In the U.S., nanny work is low-paying and unstable, and few people with legal status are willing to do it. So, hiring illegal immigrants as nannies is actually very common. However, something that usually seems like a common offense that goes unpunished becomes an unavoidable political stain for someone who could become a cabinet secretary. You could say that the carefully prepared nomination by the U.S. president ended up being derailed by two Mexican nannies, truly capsizing in a small ditch. This precisely demonstrates the strength of the legislative branch, its oversight and constraints on the executive branch. And so, the above is the first example of a president being constrained by the safety brakes. Now, the second example we're going to discuss is far more famous, complex, and impactful than the first. This is President Nixon's Watergate scandal. In the early 1970s, President Nixon, driven by personal ambition, fundamentally challenged the authority of the U.S. Constitution. And the U.S. separation of powers system confronted this challenge head-on, defended the Constitution, and delivered an enlightening response. And regarding President Nixon, those familiar with history may know that in February 1972, he made an official visit to China, ending over 20 years of isolation between the two countries and normalizing relations, which also had a positive impact on the world situation. It should be said that in this matter, Nixon made historical achievements. But it was also in 1972, just 4 months after Nixon's China visit, that the Watergate scandal occurred, becoming the biggest stain on his political career. Watergate is the name of several ordinary office buildings in Washington. At that time, the U.S. Democratic Party headquarters was located there. 1972 happened to be a U.S. presidential election year, and Nixon, as the Republican candidate who had already served as president for 4 years, was very eager for re-election. For this purpose, Nixon's campaign team racked their brains, and their campaign tactics gradually went off track. One night in June, 5 people from Nixon's campaign team, including 4 Cuban immigrants and a wiretapping expert, under the direct command of 2 White House security advisors, actually sneaked into the Democratic headquarters' 6th-floor office in the Watergate building, intending to install wiretaps to monitor their opponents' movements. But these 5 were highly unprofessional in their actions and were immediately caught by building security and patrol officers. At this point, things weren't particularly serious yet because Nixon had no prior knowledge of his subordinates' clumsy actions. So if Nixon had immediately come clean at the outset, admitting that White House security advisors and the Republican campaign team were involved in this case. Then, although he would have to bear moral responsibility, he wouldn't have to bear legal responsibility. But regrettably, Nixon didn't pull back at the brink. With one wrong thought, he embarked on a path of no return. On one hand, at press conferences, Nixon firmly denied White House involvement and even righteously demanded the FBI and Washington police conduct serious investigations. Meanwhile, on the other hand, Nixon was deeply worried about his political reputation being damaged, affecting his reelection. So he began trying every means to cover up the connection between the White House and Watergate. The FBI launched an investigation according to legal procedures. Less than a month later, the two White House security advisors who directly commanded the Watergate incident came into their sight. It turned out that on the night of the incident, these two security advisors were hiding in a hotel room across from the Watergate building, intending to support the 5 people who entered the building. But when the building lights came on and police cars arrived with sirens blaring, these two security advisors panicked first and immediately fled in disarray. They left behind a large amount of evidence in the hotel, including document boxes, phone books, wiretapping devices, and sequentially numbered $100 bills. With this evidence, the FBI actually found these two security advisors without much difficulty. In this situation, Nixon had to approach the Attorney General and the Director of the FBI, wanting these two departments to stop the investigation. But under the American system, once a case enters the judicial process, it's like a satellite entering orbit. It will proceed in the intended sequence. Trying to artificially deviate it from its orbit or even stop it would be obstruction of justice. This is a very serious crime in the United States, and it's hard to hide from all eyes, especially the news media responsible for public oversight. So whether it's the Attorney General or the Director of the FBI, although they are administrative officials appointed by the president and their political futures are closely tied to the president, however, facing the felony of obstruction of justice, they still didn't dare to cross the line. After wavering, they almost all chose to obey the system over the president. For example, FBI Deputy Director Gray, who was originally Nixon's confidant, had also leaked some investigation progress to the White House multiple times. But at the critical moment, he still directly confronted Nixon over the phone, telling him this case couldn't be covered up and would inevitably lead to the president. The best approach is to distance yourself from those involved, and meddling with the investigation can only lead to ruin. After hearing Gray's words, Nixon was silent on the phone for a long time, and then he could only say, "You should investigate thoroughly and actively." Of course, the White House's secret interference still slowed down the Watergate investigation to some extent. The investigation stalled for several months at the two security advisors, and during these crucial months, Nixon used smooth talk to avoid serious issues and ultimately won the election, successfully getting reelected. But for him, covering up the Watergate scandal became increasingly difficult. This is because the investigation went beyond the executive branch's control, and Congress, as the legislative branch, was also advancing a supervisory function. The supervisory function initiated by Congress was the grand jury's secret hearing. This grand jury is different from a trial jury in court. It's before a criminal case is filed, where randomly selected citizens hear the case on behalf of the people. In other words, the grand jury's main task is to vote based on the hearing, to decide whether to formally file the case. This actually supervises the prosecutor's work, preventing prosecutorial agencies from abusing power for personal gain. And the reason this hearing is secret, not open to the public or media, is because the case hasn't been filed yet, protecting the defendant's reputation. Before Nixon was reelected, the secret hearing on Watergate in Congress had already begun. Apart from not being public, the seriousness of the secret hearing is no different from a formal court. More and more witnesses related to Watergate were summoned to testify at the hearing before the judge and jury. And and shortly after Nixon was reelected, the seven main individuals involved in Watergate, including the two White House security advisors who directly commanded and the five caught red-handed breaking in, were all indicted after the grand jury's vote. The Watergate investigation reached a critical step. The next step was to conduct an open trial for these seven main individuals. Privately, Nixon's confidence had been contacting these seven people, hoping to buy their silence with money. At first, this tactic seemed to work, but the closer the sentencing got, the more intense their psychological shifts became, and the less they wanted to end up in jail. Moreover, under America's transparent financial system, trying to get a huge sum of money to silence seven people without a trace and pay them smoothly is also extremely difficult. So the hush money couldn't be transferred to their accounts in time. Then, at the critical moment just before sentencing, the wiretapping expert who was caught on the spot to get leniency in sentencing, he specifically wrote a letter to the presiding judge, Sirica. In the letter, the wiretapping expert shockingly pointed out that he and other defendants remained silent due to political pressure, that people in every government department involved committed perjury, and that there were other criminals in the case. At the end of March 1973, the day arrived for sentencing the seven main individuals involved in the Watergate scandal. In court, presiding Judge Sirica publicly read the wiretapping expert's letter. The letter was like a bomb exploding right there in the courtroom, and the journalists were like shrapnel flying everywhere. As soon as the court adjourned, they rushed straight to the phones, and soon all Americans knew the news. At this point, the Watergate scandal had become the focus of attention across America. Outside the White House, the press began more actively following up on all clues related to Watergate, big or small. And inside the White House, people close to Nixon began buckling under pressure, secretly planning their escape routes. For example, one of Nixon's most important legal advisors, on his lawyer's advice, proactively went to the prosecutor and spilled everything except about Nixon to seek leniency. Under these circumstances, in May 1973, Congress launched two more oversight functions targeting the executive branch. The first was to hold a hearing completely open to the nation. The second was to send an investigative team to interview White House staff. Subsequent developments proved both oversight functions played crucial roles in resolving Watergate. Let's first look at the outcome of the first oversight function. The purpose of Congress holding the public hearing was to question administrative officials suspected of violations and dereliction of duty in front of the entire nation via live television. Therefore, at the public hearing, facing the testimonies of the wiretapping expert and legal advisor, Nixon could no longer pretend innocence. He had to admit that he knew all the actions of the White House and the Republican campaign team. Now let's look at the outcome of the second oversight function. Through the investigation team's interviews, Congress obtained crucial information. For future memoir writing purposes, Nixon had recorded all his work conversations. Thus, Congress issued Nixon a written notice demanding he hand over tapes related to Watergate. As mentioned earlier, under the executive branch, there's a Department of Justice specifically responsible for investigating and prosecuting criminal cases. Although this DOJ belongs to the president's executive branch, during Watergate, it consistently followed legal procedures to investigate and prosecute suspects. So now the DOJ made the same demand to Nixon, demanding he submit the tapes. Nixon was almost driven to his last stand. On one hand, he invoked executive privilege against Congress, claiming the tapes contained top state secrets that couldn't be surrendered. On the other, he began more brazenly interfering with the DOJ, even ordering the Attorney General to fire the Watergate special prosecutor, Cox. At this point, you might have realized the two most critical paradoxes in America's power structure design erupted during Watergate. First paradox, does the president truly have privileges above Congress and courts? Second paradox, can the DOJ challenge its own boss? Thus, Watergate's historic significance lies in triggering America's greatest constitutional crisis since founding. How to resolve this constitutional crisis? By American principle, the answer was clear. Ultimately, the American people should decide. Congress and courts convened a historic judicial session. There, Judge Sirica decided to let the grand jury, ordinary citizens symbolizing America, publicly express their will. This became Watergate's most solemn moment. 23 randomly selected ordinary Americans stood up one by one, representing the people, answering Judge Sirica's identical question, do you require the president to justify withholding evidence? All jurors clearly answered yes. Thus, Judge Sirica firmly ordered Nixon to surrender the tapes by a deadline or face contempt charges and massive fines. Oh, Nixon finally realized he was facing public outrage, so he quickly humbled himself and made a TV statement. On TV, he apologized to the American people and begged for their sympathy to let him keep the tapes. But privately, Nixon still clung to hope, using his power to fight against the law. He kept pressuring the Attorney General to fire the special prosecutor under the pretext of national interest. With Cox holding firm, the Attorney General told Nixon that if he insisted on firing Cox, he would resign. This attitude infuriated Nixon, and he made a brutal and despicable move. This move made his impeachment irreversible. That is, Nixon preempted the resignation by having the White House announce the firing first. Immediately, the Deputy Attorney General resigned out of moral outrage. And then, under Nixon's order, the third in command at the Justice Department signed the order to fire the special prosecutor, Cox's dismissal order. That night, fired Cox gathered reporters and sorrowfully said it was unimaginable in a democracy. Cox was fired, and the whole Justice Department was under heavy executive interference. The news spread through media to all Americans who could hardly believe an elected president would do such a thing. In the following days, Congress got 300,000 protest calls nationwide, and cars kept honking on Pennsylvania Avenue near the White House. Suddenly, Americans' distrust in the executive branch peaked, and impeaching the president became the talk of the town. So what exactly is impeachment as a power check mechanism in the U.S.? It's a process of the legislative branch, Congress, and a special criminal procedure. It targets only high government officials, including the president, ministers, congressmen, and judges. Before Nixon, among U.S. presidents, only Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln after his assassination, had an impeachment motion brought against him by Congress. But at the last moment, President Johnson was acquitted by just one vote. So the impeachment motion against President Nixon by Congress is the impeachment mechanism. This is only the second time it has been initiated in over 200 years of American history, and Nixon is already surrounded by enemies. A few days later, he had to instruct his lawyer to comply with the court and Judge Sirica's demand to hand over the tapes related to Watergate. At this point, after countless efforts, Nixon's tapes were finally played in court, revealing not only discussions about raising millions in hush money, but also Nixon blatantly instructing aides on how to commit perjury. This was enough for the grand jury to characterize the president's actions. On February 25, 1974, the grand jury voted 19-0 to conclude that Richard Nixon was involved in a conspiracy to deceive America and obstruct justice. The final outcome had arrived. By late May 1974, 2 years after the incident, the Watergate investigation and trial proceedings finally reached the Supreme Court. As we mentioned earlier, the U.S. Supreme Court best embodies the value of the judicial branch, with its duty to interpret the Constitution. In the Watergate trial, the Supreme Court had to address whether the president can place himself above the law. In response, the Supreme Court issued a historic ruling. Nixon must comply with court orders, provide evidence, abide by judgments, and cannot use executive privilege or national security as excuses. 1 month later, at the end of June 1974, Nixon proactively announced his resignation. Less than 2 months later, in late August, Congress passed the resolution to impeach Nixon with an overwhelming vote of 412 to 3. Then on September 8th, President Ford, who succeeded Nixon, announced a pardon for Nixon, exempting him from all possible legal prosecution. Thus, the tumultuous Watergate scandal finally came to a complete end. After that, such and such gate became a synonym for negative events in news reports. Most Americans felt that pardoning Nixon was fair, as being forced to resign was punishment enough for him. As Nixon himself said, "I handled Watergate in such a wrong way that it will be a burden I carry every day for the rest of my life." Well, that's the story of Nixon and the Watergate scandal. From Watergate, we clearly see that under America's separation of powers, no individual, not even the president, can place themselves above the law. Even when a president overreaches and commits crimes, the oversight mechanisms of the legislative and judicial branches activate, effectively constraining both the president and the executive branch, forcing them back into constitutional order to defend our founding values. This is precisely why the U.S. Constitution has maintained its vitality for over 2 centuries. That concludes our interpretation of "The President is Unreliable." Reading notes are below the audio. See you tomorrow.